I'll say up front that I originally was going to talk on a different process. And but when we went to see the movie Oppenheimer, then there were questions by a number of the students about it. And in consulting with one of my most important people, my wife, and David, and we decided that it would be appropriate to talk a little bit more about the Trinity site and the lead up into Trinity and Los Alamos in itself. And since I had spent some time there and was familiar with Los Alamos, that seemed to make sense. But what I want to do real quickly, let me go over a couple of terms that we'll be using, and just as a reminder, the first is alpha particle. An alpha particle is basically a helium nucleus with the electron stripped off. And so it carries a positive 2 charge. And then the next term there is, that you'll hear is an alpha N reaction. And this reaction is when an alpha particle bombards a light metal, like aluminum or beryllium, and causes a reaction which releases a new element, but more importantly, releases another neutron. And so it's a neutron source. Fission is basically the splitting of an element. In this case, I put up the fissioning of uranium-235 by a neutron. It splits into 2 branches of elements, one generally around 60 atomic number and the other around 30 atomic number, somewhere in that range. And it goes over a wide variety of different elements in that splitting. And then 2 terms that are going to be very important. First of all is critical mass. That's the smallest amount of fissile material that is needed to sustain a chain reaction, nuclear chain reaction. And also cross-section. Now, cross-section, actually what that is a probability. So if you talk about cross-section for a reaction, you're talking about how often or how easily that reaction can occur. And so you'll hear those terms as it goes. So maybe that'll help you as I go through. Now, real quickly, in late 1938, Otto Hahn, a German chemist, was able to show that when he bombarded uranium with a neutron, that barium showed up as a result. And this was highly unusual. They didn't understand it. He initially only talked with Lisa Meitner, who was his partner for many years, but she escaped Germany because she was Jewish, and she basically left with the clothes on her back and was in Sweden, and he stayed in contact with her. But then he said, well, I'm really going to have to publish this. So in December of 1938, they published the fact that we are getting a splitting of the atom. They don't, but basically he said, we don't understand it. We know that it happens, but we don't understand it. And that Christmas, Otto Frisch was being a good citizen and visiting his maiden aunt, Lisa Meitner, in Sweden. And all they did for that week around Christmas was talk about the results that Otto Hahn had sent to her. And as a result, because Otto Frisch was at that time working with Niels Bohr at the Niels Bohr Institute, he understood the idea of what is called a liquid drop model. And if you look at on the left, whoops, this is not working right. On the left there, you see how you can visualize a liquid drop fluctuating, being hit by a neutron, and popping apart into two smaller elements. And so they were able to understand what the experimental results that Albert Hahn had published. And so Frisch went back to Denmark after the holidays, told Bohr, Niels Bohr said, yes, this must be the way it is. But Frisch asked Bohr not to tell anybody about it until he had a chance to publish it and get priority for his ideas. And so Bohr agreed to that, but he immediately got on a ship and sailed to the U.S. And on the ship, he talked about it all the time with his partner, Leon Rosenfeld, but forgot to tell Leon that he was not supposed to tell anybody. So as soon as he got to the U.S., he immediately went to Princeton and started telling everybody about fission. And Bohr was quite upset when this occurred, but he immediately sent a note to Frisch to get that paper in the works. And fortunately, he had already done that. And then Bohr and John Wheeler showed in Princeton, they showed that it was uranium-235 was the isotope that was responsible for the fissioning. Now, as a result of all this, a lot of work started in the United States right away, and a lot of the Jewish immigrants were worried that Germany already had a head start. And so 3 of these refugees, Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller, convinced Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Roosevelt asking him to start a research effort in this area. And it was delivered by a friend of Roosevelt, Alexander Sachs. He finally got to Roosevelt in October of '39, and the letter, just briefly, I want to get to the second page. Basically, there at the very end, I understand that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium, and that she should have taken this early action might perhaps be understood as grounds that the Germans are actually working on this, and that the Americans need to work on uranium too. And basically, what Roosevelt asked, and where Roosevelt's question was, so you want us to get working on this and we be able to blow up Germany before Germany blows us up? And they said, yes, that's what we need to do. And so as a result of that, there was a committee formed, and James Conant, who was president of Harvard, was the head of the committee. Ernest Lawrence from Berkeley, Arthur Compton from Chicago, Harold Urey from Columbia, Lyman Briggs from the National Bureau of Standards, and Igor Murphy, who was an industrial chemist, were on this committee. Now, it's a committee. How fast do committees work? And so they did a lot of study, and they identified these places, but very little work was being done. In the summer of 1942, Robert Oppenheimer convened a summer institute, or a summer study group. Some of the people there was Hans Bethe, Van Eck, Edward Teller, Carl Bosch, Richard Tolman, and Robert Serber. And they reviewed the status of fission reactions. And these were all theoretical people. But what they did was identify the chief uncertainties that needed to be dealt with in terms of experimental data. And they also very quickly concluded that a fission bomb based on uranium-235, if you could separate it in its pure form, was feasible. After that, Edward Teller said something about what he called a super bomb. And the note that I had read is that they spent the rest of the time talking about that and whether it would set the Earth's atmosphere on fire. And it left the fission work as it was. But again, it's all theoretical. Very little experimental work was being done. And then in August of 1942, James Conant asked the president to turn over the production and the development and production of this fission program to the Army. And so the Army took over, and they were then identified as the Manhattan Engineering District because the first person who was in charge of this, Colonel Marshall, had his office in Manhattan, New York. And so it was the idea was you name it from wherever your office is. And so this was called then the Manhattan, or MED for short. And then in September of 42, Leslie Groves, who had just finished the construction of the Pentagon, was appointed as the leader of this, and he was then promoted to general, and he was also someone who did not wait around to do things. Immediately after he was appointed, he sort of got the committee to say, okay, we have 8 people on this committee, that's too many, I only need 3. And so he told them he only needed 3 people on his oversight committee, and when they agreed to that, he said, okay, if there's nothing else, I'm leaving. And they sort of said, what? And he left that very day to catch a train to Knoxville, Tennessee, to buy the land for the bridge. He then also set up a huge production site at Hanford in Washington State. Groves did not leave a lot of things to ferment. He pushed forward very quickly, and one of the comments he said is that the scientists are going to have to realize that you don't just look at things and test them, but you immediately start to develop and produce all in one effort. You don't wait until things are perfect. So, early fall, Groves did a visit to Columbia, Chicago, Berkeley. And while he was at Berkeley, he met Robert Oppenheimer, and it became apparent to everyone at the time there needed to be a new lab put forth which would be associated with the development and of the bomb. And so Groves, after a period of time, appointed Oppenheimer the director. Now, a lot of people were upset about this because Oppenheimer lacked a Nobel Prize. He lacked any administrative experience because he was a theoretical physicist. And most of the other scientists sort of thought him a rather haughty, somewhat less than approachable person. And so but Groves said, you're it. Oh, I forgot to mention his association with Communist Party of America. Although he was never shown to be a member, his wife had been, and a number of his friends, his brother, that all didn't sit well with certain people. And so the first thing was a selection of a site for this new lab, and Groves wanted it to be a military lab. And so it needed to be far from the coast, but it needed to be a place that could be secured and access be monitored. And one of the places that was suggested was Jemez Springs in New Mexico, which is northwest of Albuquerque. Jemez Springs is a very narrow valley up through the Jemez Mountains. And when they went there, it was immediately rejected because it was too confining, there wasn't enough water, access was difficult. Rose liked, then Oppenheimer suggested, oh, I know of a little place up the way. And so they took the back roads in through what is called the Valley Grande in the Jemez Mountains and came out on the Los Alamos Plateau. And there, Rose immediately liked it because the site was on a 7,000-foot mesa and with canyons on both sides and very restricted access. And Oppenheimer thought the view of the San de Cristos Mountains, which was in the east, gave the place a beautiful site and one that would inspire people to work there. What was there at the time was Los Alamos Ranch School. This was a school for very privileged young men. The tuition was at that time $3,000 to $4,000. This is in 1942. So today's money would be maybe $25,000 to $30,000 a year, maybe more. But this was a highly academic and highly physical program. It was the boys wore shorts all year round. They slept on screened-in porches, and in the morning did classes, and in the afternoon took care of the cows or played sports. There's a picture of they're playing hockey on Ashley Pond, and here they're doing something with the cows, I guess, as a result. Now, in December, the school got notice that the Army was taking over. There's 52,000 acres, some of which was already under Forest Service. And they got notice, and they asked if they would get another month, so they doubled everything up. And in February 8th of 1942, 43, I'm sorry, I got a problem there. Then they closed the school, and the Army took over. Now, the original plans for the laboratory were that maybe 6 theoretical physicists, we would have 6 assistants, 12 experimental physicists, maybe 14 assistants, 5 secretaries, and a few hundred security and support personnel in the Army. These numbers changed rapidly and went up and up. The major problem that Oppenheimer had was that Rose wanted the laboratory to be a military installation. And initially, Oppenheimer was okay with that. In fact, the scientists would actually be wearing uniforms. Well, that was a real problem because the scientists weren't at all ready to work under military authority. And so he was having big problems recruiting anybody because, first of all, he couldn't tell them the purpose of the lab, he couldn't specify the location of the lab, and he couldn't tell them how long they would have to stay there. And so this caused a problem. There was a compromise, and this compromise was that Oppenheimer would be in charge of the scientific work and be responsible for the civilian secrecy with the civilian personnel. And so he could say, we want you to work for the government on a secret project. You'll be working with the finest minds in your field, and you can help win the war. And pretty soon, professors and graduate students began to disappear and travel to 109 East Palace Street in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, give you the typical recruitment. Here is Donald Hording. He has a PhD in physics from Harvard, and he's working at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and in underwater explosive research. His boss comes in to him and says, "How would you like a new job?" And Donald must have said, "Have I done something wrong? Are you firing me? You know, what is this new job?" And he said, "Well, no, nothing wrong." "Well, what kind of job?" "Well, I can't tell you." "Well, where is it?" "I can't really say. My lips are sealed. Let me know whether you'll take this job in the morning." Well, what did he say? He said, "No." The phone rings. President of Harvard calls. And, excuse me, and as a result, he gets a phone call from Dr. Conant, who asked him what in the world has gotten into him, what is he saying no to, and so he ends up going. Well, his wife had a master's in chemistry, and so before he went, he made sure he negotiated a pair of scientists. And the other thing which must have killed him more was he had to sell his 45-foot yacht. And they ended up buying a 37 Ford Coupe to travel across the country to New Mexico. So giving up a 45-foot yacht for a 37 Ford, I don't know what a 37 Ford Coupe looks like, but I don't think it would look like a yacht for sure. We'll come back to, we'll see him in just a bit. 109 East Palace Avenue was the office run by Dorothy McCribbin. She met Oppenheimer in the hotel restaurant and immediately accepted the job. She said, "I have never met a person with magnetism that hits you so fast and so completely." So she located the office. It's just off of what is the square there in Santa Fe. And it became the place where all bewildered scientists who would arrive at the small train station in Lambie or rode the bus into Santa Fe would be looking around. And so if locals saw somebody odd looking around, they would say, "Oh, you need to go see Dorothy," in the right direction. And she was responsible for taking care of people, answer questions, and then she would provide transportation to the Hill. The Hill was the term that was used by locals to describe Los Alamos. Now, the road to the Hill was rather interesting. There you can see, first of all, you have to cross the Rio Grande, and there's at what is called Ottaway, and there's a bridge at Ottaway. The bridge still exists. When we were there a couple of years ago, it's still there. It's closed off. You don't use it, but it's still there. And then there's the switchback road up to the Hill. And the original part this was the original switchback. As you see winding around, this is the path of the newer road. Now the story of why there was a newer road goes, the Army initially said, "We don't want to spend any money on roads. You know, if you can get up there, that's all that matters." And what happened was several enterprising corporals, maybe privates, decided that the general needed to ride the road in a truck with the springs blocked. And so they blocked the springs, and the general got to the top of the hill and decided, "I think you need a new road." So they got a better road. But you can visualize having driven across the country in your Ford coupe, and that's what you face to get up to the hill. The proposed site is on the left here, and they retained Miller Lodge, which was part of the Wrench School, and also they retained the houses of the instructors, and that was called Bathtub Row because they were the only houses on the hill that had bathtubs. And then several of the other buildings were retained in this area. This is the pond. The picture I had of them playing ice hockey, that's the pond right there, Ashley Pond. And then the technical area, which would be under barbed wire and so forth, was here along what is now Trinity Drive. And just to give you an idea where Los Alamos is, here's Albuquerque down here, the Lamry, where the train comes in, Santa Fe, and then you come up, go across the San Ildefonso Pueblo, and get into Los Alamos that way. Whoops, I missed something. Okay, population. In March of 43, 1,500. January of 44, there was now up to 3,500. And then in January of 45, it was over 5,700 people. So the 6 theoretical physicists and the 12 got multiplied. Another person another scientist that showed up here is Richard Feynman. Rather interesting. He was a graduate student at Princeton in theoretical physics, and he joined the group of Professor Wilson. Professor Wilson was working on an alternate isotope separation process that was competing with Lawrence from Berkeley. That process lost out, and so Richard Wilson didn't know what his group was hired. They were signed on, but he didn't know what to do with them, and so he sent Richard Feynman to Chicago to the metallurgical lab there, and he told him, learn what you can. And so Richard said he really didn't know what he said. I'm just this little peon student, and he's sent into this lab. And so what he did is he started asking people, what are you doing? And he got very lucky because the first person he asked, he thought about his problem for just a little bit, and then he said, why don't you try this? And 30 minutes later, the guy came back and told him, yeah, that's exactly what we need to do, and he solved that problem. So he got this really high level of what you say, everybody thought he was a genius. And he then went on to Los Alamos. There are a number of things that we could talk about there. One of the biggest is he was known as a safe cracker, and he could crack safes, and also combinations, but that's a whole other story. One of the things he said is he admits to a fatal flaw, anything secret, I always try to undo. Now, on the sad side of his story is he married his childhood sweetheart, even though he knew she had tuberculosis. And one of the things that he did was say he would go to Los Alamos, but he had to make sure that his wife had proper medical treatment. And so Oppenheimer is the one that set up treatment in Albuquerque. And so Feynman was allowed to go and visit his wife. They were only married for about 16 months before she died. And the person that loaned him the car for him to go to her deathbed was Klaus Fuchs, the famous spy. Now, when they began one of the things that the compromise allowed Oppenheimer to make everyone aware of all the problems associated with the system. And so Robert Serber, who was one of Oppenheimer's original students and had gone to the University of Illinois, I believe, had taken notes of the Summer Institute, and so he gave 5 lectures in the spring of '43 on the status of what was known at the time. And he said the object of the project is to produce a practical military weapon. The energy is released by a fast neutron chain reaction. And he said, obviously we wanted to develop a bomb. Well, as soon as he said the word bomb, Oppenheimer looked around and realized there were a lot of construction workers all around because they were still building the labs and so forth. And he sent a note up to Serber that said, do not use the word bomb, say gadget. And so from then on, everything was called a gadget. All right, so these were some of the code words. Atom was the top, bomb was a gadget, the atomic bomb was a topic vote, and then the isotopes that were important to you. Uranium-235 was 25, uranium-238 was 28, and plutonium-239 was 49. And so you didn't use the terms uranium or plutonium, you used the numbers. There were also a number of Los Alamos couldn't be mentioned by name. And in fact, there was a newspaper article published in the Cleveland paper sometime in the mid to late spring about the secret city that was being built in New Mexico. Groves got a hold of it and said, find out who wrote that and put him in the military and I'll send him to Alaska for the rest of the day. Well, it turned out the newspaper, the gentleman who wrote it was about 65 years old, so Groves was not able to do that. However, he also was known, there were a number of free-speaking servicemen who would disappear very rapidly from Los Alamos site. Okay, so in the summer of '43, basically that there was a lot of things that we didn't know. The basic fission process was not completely understood. The fission cross sections, how fast neutrons would work, was not well defined. We didn't know the critical mass of either the uranium-235 or plutonium-239. And that, of course, how you're going to build a bomb if you don't know what the critical mass is. And then other properties of fast neutrons. And then finally, one last little clicker here is called spontaneous fission. Spontaneous fission actually occurs in heavy elements where they actually undergo fission without absorbing a neutron. And so as the elements get heavier and heavier, spontaneous fission becomes more and more important. The colloquium is where the group leaders met once a week and allowed the laboratory to retain a more academic character. They could explain their problems, talk to each other. This is, you can see Oppenheimer right there, Enrico Fermi. Feynman is somewhere in there. It's not a good picture. But this was part of the compromise. Now, the technical area was, again, built around Ashley Pond and contained buildings that were administrative buildings as well as laboratories. One of the things that happened when people began to arrive in early April of '43 the dorms were done, the theater was done, and the cafeteria was done. The labs weren't. Why? Well, the person who had been the contractor for that job had built dorms before, had built theaters before, had built cafeterias before, never built a lab, had no idea what it required. And so the scientists had to go in and say, we need water here, we need water there, we need electricity, and so forth. And also point out that the accelerators that they were bringing had to have firm foundations in order to be useful. And whereas they had one of the accelerators was sitting on fill dirt, another was sitting in the basement, but it was sitting on what is called tuff, which is a volcanic ash. And so all these things had to be changed. Now, bring back another gentleman, Otto Frisch. Remember, he and Lisa Meitner were the ones that understood Otto Hahn's ideas. He came as part of the British effort, and the idea is how do you measure the critical assembly? How do you measure that critical mass? Well, he came up with what the term is called tickling the tail of the dragon. When they eventually had enough uranium-235, they built a subcritical part of 235 that had a hole in the center. And then they had a elevator-type apparatus that allowed them to drop a second piece of 235 through that hole, and at the instant it was in the hole, it went critical, but then dropped out immediately. And so they were able to measure at the instant it went through. And that was where they were able to confirm the amount of uranium-235 necessary to build the little boy bomb, which was the first weapon. And that was basically a gun weapon. They took a howitzer, stripped it, and basically shot a subcritical piece into another subcritical piece to form the critical mass for that weapon to work. And the theory of this was so tight that they knew that they didn't even have to test it. They didn't have to test that one. Oppenheimer was able to recruit then. Gross's choice was spot on for the leader. He was able to recruit about 50% of the people that he tried to recruit, but he had the ability to make everyone feel important and part of the job, and inspired others to do and tackle difficult things. Hans Bertha said there was just nobody else at the lab who came close to him in total knowledge. Security on the Hill was very tight, and everyone had badges. And I see that when they started taking badges, the same person who did my driver's license must have been working. Some of the people look okay, and then others are sort of okay. And when you go to the guardhouse, one of those guardhouses still exists as you come up on the plateau. Now, what was life like on there? If you were a scientist or other, there was something called Oppie's whistle, which went off at 7 a.m. And that was sort of the time for people to be coming to work. Fermi rode a bicycle most of the time. Oppenheimer would be seen walking around with a number of young scientists trailing along. Niels Bohr visited there several times. He visited there as James Baker. That was his name in the U.S. And so when someone came to pick him up at the hotel, they asked him, Mr. Baker, and he, and they finally realized that was him. Of course, guess what name was on his briefcase? Niels Bohr. Generally, they worked six days, 10 to 16-hour days. Saturday night was filled with parties, dances, plays, skits, and dinner parties. This was the release time. And then Sundays were used for outdoor activities. In the winter, it was skiing. Supposedly, Sawyer Ski Hill was made by using primer cord on trunks of trees by Christy Akowski, who was leader of the explosive group. Don't know that for sure, but that's the story I got. And in the summer, you can go hiking all through the hills, through the area. It's a beautiful area. It was not a Shangri-La. And so the place, there was always water problems. Mail in and out was censored. Initially, they had only one telephone line down to Santa Fe, and it was not a very good one. The story goes that they called down one time and said, we need 8 extra lunches, and they got 8 heavy trucks instead. So there were certain things you could say in the mail, and if you didn't follow the guidelines, you got your letter back with the bad things cut out of it. But the tenements were, nothing was paved, and so in the thunderstorm season, then you had quite a bit of mud like this. You see the washing machines were at work, and then as they said, at nighttime, it was on Saturday night, it was party time. Some of the housing here, this caused quite a bit of problems in terms of morale, because the men, if you were a single man, this was your barracks, and that's what it looked like inside with a single stove. The married scientists had much better accommodations, as you can see, as the year went by. Now, in the spring of 1944, the first amounts of plutonium-239 began to ship in from Oak Ridge. Now, this plutonium was made by the graphite reactor at Oak Ridge, and it was the first reactor-produced plutonium that was available. And what they found was that not only was plutonium-239 there, but being in the reactor for a period of time, it absorbed another neutron, and plutonium-240 was present. Plutonium-240 has a high enough spontaneous fission reaction to make the gun method impossible to use. And so they couldn't put the subcritical pieces together fast enough before it would fizzle away. And so all of a sudden, all the money spent to build Hanford and the graphite reactor and so forth became a question. But they decided to go after a theory which said if we can develop an implosion technique where we can blow everything together into a small sphere, that this would be the way to work. And it required development of new theories, new experiments, new high explosives, and the high explosives had to be made in a lens effect so that they focused everything into one point. And so the whole lab was redesigned for the implosion. And again, remember the 235 little boy, that's no problem. That's going to happen. They just shoved aside. But they didn't know whether this was going to work. One of the comments I thought was rather interesting there, but one of the generals who came up and observed Los Alamos said it's too bad with all this talent it could not have been spent on something more useful to the war effort. And General Groves then stepped in early 45 and said, okay, this is the design for the implosion. Because what was happening, as scientists do, we were all looking at all the various ways that we could do it. And finally Groves said, you're going to do it this way. All right, so solve the problems associated with this. And so, but because there were so many uncertainties associated with the gadget, a test would be necessary. Project Trinity. The test was given the term Trinity by Oppenheimer. Some people say it had to do with a poem, and the last I read is that Frank Oppenheimer, his brother, said he has no idea where he came up with the idea of calling it Trinity. So Kenneth Bainbridge was put in charge of the test, and so they had to decide on how they were going to measure the blast, measure the ground shock, measure the number of neutrons given off, measure the gamma rays, photograph this test. And so there was quite a bit of, first of all, a selection of the area. And this is in southeast of Albuquerque in basically a desert. And it was part of the White Sands bombing range. And there was very little. There was one ranch there which was easily occupied and people asked to leave. As you can see on the right-hand side, here's the place where they built the tower. This is the McDonald Ranch House, which is nearby, that they had to evacuate the family. Then there were shelters built here here's the south, west, and north shelters, which were built to make measurements. And then here is the base camp for the workers to build the Trinity site. Now, one of the things they had to do was they'd never done something like this before, so they needed to know, okay, how does all this, the blast and so forth, how did we measure? And so what they did is they built a platform and they put 100 tons of TNT on a 20-foot platform. They detonated this on May 7th, and as a result, they were able to understand the types of things that they needed to measure in order to understand the blast. And so, and this told them that, we've got to bury our cables deeper because some of the cables were burnt, and they had to come up with some additional instruments for the system. But it was a rehearsal test. Then, under a lot of pressure from Groves, because they wanted to get this on and get the test underway, even though there was a lot of sort of pushback by the scientists, they began to assemble the gadget, and you can see here the gadget was assembled on the ground where they put in the igniters or initiators. There were 32 of them for the explosives, and then they would tape over the hole to keep dust and sand and dirt from going in. And then the next day they were able to put the plutonium in, and finally when they had things, all that put together, they raised it to the top of the tower. The tower is 100 feet in the air. And then once it was there, once it was in the tower, then they put the they put the detonators and the firing mechanism installed into the gadget. And there's Bainbridge standing there with the gadgets. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this whole thing, if you like to find people who were involved, remember Donald Horniman, the gentleman who turned them down first until he got a phone call from the president of Harvard. He designed the electrical switching device for the implosion bomb, and it required 32 detonations around a spherical device that would occur in less than 1/1,000,000th of a second. And we didn't have computers then, by the way. Think of those things. And and you can, whoops, you can see Donald sitting there outside, and Oppenheimer wanted someone to babysit the bomb. No one stepped forward, but Donald figured he was the smallest and also the youngest person in the group, and so he got to climb the 100-foot tower and sit in the metal aluminum box up there during the thunderstorm. And these are high explosives, and he was reading a comic book. He was very happy when he got the call to climb down, but he had to wait out the thunderstorm in the metal shed with the gadget. So then he climbed down, and then at 5:29, July 16, 1945, we had the first atomic bomb there, and this was viewed by a number of people around the area. There were people at the base camp. There were people at Companion Hills, which is about 20 miles away. That's where Edward Teller got put on the shaving sunscreen. They never said in the movie whether it was SPF 50 or not. We wondered. Richard Feynman said, I'm going to stay in the truck because the windshield will take out the UV radiation. And so he claims to be the only one to have actually seen the explosion, because everybody else had on very dark welder's glasses and they couldn't see it. Teller had a conversation with Richard Serber while they were waiting for the bomb to go off, and he said, what are you going to do about the rattlesnakes? And Serber said, I'll take a bottle of whiskey. And Edward Teller says, well, what are you going to do if the sky is ignited by the bomb? And Serber said, I'll take a second bottle of whiskey. So, anyway, the Army already had cover stories about an ammunition dump blowing up. It was seen the flash was seen as far away as El Paso, Texas, It broke windows about 120 miles away. And Oppenheimer then called Compton and said, "You'll be interested to know that we caught a big fish." That was the code word for there. After the test, Herbert Anderson of the F division, the F stands for Fermi, because Fermi, when he came there, was given his own division. He didn't have any specific tasks. People would just go to his division with problems, and Fermi was the one who could work them out. Anyway, they had 2 lead-lined tanks that were used then to go gather soil samples from the blast area. Now, Fermi was being one and Herbert Anderson the other. Fermi's tank broke down, so he never got to go in. But Herbert Anderson went in, they scraped up soil samples, and this was the beginning of the way, until we stopped doing testing, that they actually measured the yield on a weapon is by measuring the fission products they found in the debris. And you can see here, this is an overhead picture. This is where the Trinity, the crater, and it's not really, it wasn't really a big crater, and there's just nothing left. Over here to the right, you see the test crater is right there. And then several months later, they actually were observing the tower, or what was left of the tower. Notice they're wearing booties. That was their radiation safety at the time. And this was on the right here is a picture of what it may have looked like with the green sand, or the trinitite that resulted. If you're interested in this area, 2 of the books I would recommend, one by Richard Rhodes, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and then another, Manhattan Project, by Stephen Groff. Those are very good books. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I can try to answer them.
We always think of Albert Einstein, and you even showed him the beginning. How come, or a non-chemist, how come Einstein really wasn't a part of this?
First of all, he didn't think that it was going to work, period. He said, even in that letter, he says, maybe, maybe not. He was very, and he really did not. His idea was theory, and he just didn't get involved in this area. Yes.
What was they had a uranium bomb that they were extremely confident would work. Right. Why did they pursue the plutonium bomb? Was it just much more powerful?
They only had enough uranium for one. And the plutonium production, once Hanford got going, Hanford, the first plutonium from Hanford came around January of 45. But once it started, it really cranked up. And they were able to get that because with the uranium, they were having to separate isotopes, which is very difficult. The plutonium, they used precipitation, dissolution steps. I can't remember exactly how many, but it was much easier, and so they could get the nitrate. What's interesting is both places, a lot of people saw all this money and workers and everything going in. The uranium that came out of Oak Ridge came out in small suitcases. And they rode the train from there to Chicago, and they turned the suitcase over to another security person who then rode the train to Atlanta. And the idea was the person, they neither one knew what they had, and they didn't know where it came from or where it was going.
Were they bloodlined?
Oh. Plutonium, I've never grabbed a hold of 239, but supposedly the sphere is warm enough from the alpha that you can feel it warm in your hand.
Mm.
Uranium-235, its half-life is so long that it doesn't. And then 238 plutonium is what they use to power the space satellites, thermoelectric. Yes?
Is there anything from the movie that they got completely wrong, or there was one thing that you thought wasn't portrayed exactly right?
Nothing really out of place. The one that I did have a little bit of sort of with them is the story of fission. Okay, fission, was announced by Bohr in D.C. at a meeting, and then it got to Berkeley by way of the New York Times. An article was written up in the New York Times, and you saw in the movie the guy in the barber's chair. Well, the movie kind of led you to believe that was Lawrence, but it wasn't. It was Alvarez, Louis Alvarez. He was the one, and he actually ran to find his student because the student had been researching the same thing and had just did not understand what had happened. If he had understood what had happened, he would have been able to say, "Oh, this is, what's going on." So, and that's the only one that I really thought that I had.
So did he really try to poison his teacher?
Hmm?
Did he really try to poison his teacher? Oppenheimer?
Supposedly. Now, it wasn't Bohr, but it was his mentor. I can't remember the guy's name. But yeah, there was something about cyanide in that.
All right, well, there's no further questions for our speakers.